Hello, and welcome to the class Handling Change Effectively. Let's begin with a brief prayer. Dear God, we call upon you and we ask that you guide this class as well as the lives of each person participating in it. Thank you, living, loving Spirit. Welcome to this class. One thing we can be certain of: change will continue to happen in each of our lives. And it's vital that we have a handle on change so that hopefully it doesn't sneak up on us unexpectedly. Actually, change is a good thing. It's a great thing, because it's only through change that our lives and life itself can get better. It's important to remember that people can and do change. It's helpful to know this when those close to you are not behaving in a way that you would like. You can focus your idea on loving them and supporting them, and not doing that or speaking that which will further their guilt or shame. I quit smoking half a century ago after being a smoker for 20 years. And it happened because I felt an incentive to do so. You see, I was with some buddies planning to run a 10K race a couple of months hence. And when I went out to practice with them, I couldn't keep up with them. So I knew it was because I was a smoker. So I determined right then and there that I would get rid of smoking. And within a week or two, I had a ceremony in which I discarded all of my smoking paraphernalia, ashtrays, threw out the cigarettes, crunched them up. And, after a period of a few days and working with meditation as well, the smoking left me for all time. Up until that time, I had not been able to do it. I had that incentive. And that's so important for people. So if you have a loved one who is dealing with an addiction, such as gambling, alcohol, pot, whatever it might be, it is through an incentive where they can get rid of the messiness of it. They can be free of it holding dominion over their life. And it is through that incentive that they can get rid of whatever that addiction is, rather than through guilt or shame. The author, Bruce Feiler, wrote a book recently, Life is in the Transitions, in which he delves into how change comes about and with what frequency. He also relates a number of surprises that his studies reveal about change. I'll share some of this along with my take on the spiritual dimension, the spiritual impact on change, which he doesn't get into much. A study conducted a few years ago showed that children with special needs do better when they know the history of their family. When any of us tends to think of the history of our family, what we'd like to see is a history of ascending, where the family has continued to do better over time. There are actually three ways that people tend to think in terms of their family's history. One is ascending, things getting better. A second is descending, things getting worse, or oscillating, ups and downs. We might think that youngsters would feel better about their family if they saw an ascending history. However, what these special needs kids preferred was to see their history of their family in terms of an oscillating ups and downs, because this, for them, they know is reality. It reflects the truth. And so does everyone else really want to see their family history in this way, in which really there are the ups and downs that occur in the natural course of life. Now, this is the reality of change in our lives. It oscillates. There is good and bad. We like to think of our lives as being on an upward progression, continually getting better, but that's not reality. We all experience what Filer calls disruptors. He defines a disruptor as an event or experience that interrupts the everyday flow of one's life. He identifies primary areas in which these disruptors tend to occur. The first are love relationships, getting married, getting divorced, gaining a new family member, having a child be identified as having special needs, death, suicide, addiction. The second way is issues of identity, where there is a change in the living situation, a change in gender identification, homelessness, imprisonment, a victim of crime. The third way is through change in our beliefs, a change in our religion or our religious beliefs, a beginning or an ending of schooling, a taking on of adult education, a personal calling, a change in community service habits. A third way, or further way, is through work situations, a change in jobs, a loss of a job or a quitting of a job, change in careers, retirement. And final category is our body's experience of change, an accident or a personal injury, chronic illness, a personal addiction, mental illness, weight issues. Now, when we examine these, the reality is that they're occurring regularly in our lives. Filer's finding was that we experience 30 to 40 such disruptors over an average lifetime, which means they're occurring about every 12 to 18 months. So every few years, we tend to experience what he calls a major disruptor that really impacts our life. And Filer calls this a life quake, that being a forceful burst of change in one's life that leads to a period of upheaval, transition, and renewal. Those three categories where there is an upheaval that happens to us, and then we transition, which tends to take the longest time of all three areas. And the third is a renewal, where we're coming back to living our life on an increase, on an upcline again. Now, the average duration of one of these life quakes, surprisingly enough, is 4 to 7 years. We don't tend to think that they require that long, but they do. So say an average of 5 years, which means that if the average person has 3 to 5 of these life quakes in a lifetime, it takes up a significant portion, perhaps a third or a half of one's life. Now, what are some of these life quakes? Well, the loss of a loved one, a threat to our identity, a situation where our beliefs are shaken fundamentally, where we either lose a job or have a shakeup to it, where we experience an illness or something that impacts our body's ability to function. Now, when I looked at my own situation, I had far more than 3 to 5. I had more like 9 different, what I would term life quakes in my life to this point. The upshot of all this is that rather than our lives being stable and secure, the way we would like to think of them as being, a linear experience or a solid expectation, they are in fact rather fluid, fickle, changeable, adaptable, non-linear. Now, the chief promise of a linear life was regularity. During the last century, a couple of psychologists came up with the idea that our lives were predictable. And a woman by the name of Gail Sheehy grabbed hold of this idea and wrote a book called Passages that came out in the early 1970s, about a half century ago, in which she argued that there were set expectations for one's life. There were the trying 20s, the catch 30, that transition time, a deadline decade of the 30s, and the age 40 crucible. She promoted the idea that there was inevitably a midlife crisis that most persons would experience. She said 80% of people would. And she said it was not only that it might happen, it would happen. She sold 5 million books. The Library of Congress called it one of the most influential books of the 20th century. But it turns out this was wrong. The truth is that life is almost totally random. The chief promise of a nonlinear life is irregularity. Each of us lives with twists and turns, booms, busts, curveballs, lucky breaks, and every conceivable detour and twist. Now, a primary side of all this can be volatility, unease, a state of anxiety, a sense of dread, a lingering state of uncertainty where we ask ourselves, what's ahead? Is it going to be good or is it going to be bad? But it doesn't have to be that way. We can live with the awareness that there will be changes, there will be transitions, but we can live with the expectation that good is in front of us, and it is more likely to be when we live that way. So when these disruptors arise, we try lots of solutions. They might be work, liquor, pot, porn, sex, shopping, prayer, meditation, food, exercise. Most of us have tried most of these. I'll get further into the real situation. But right now, let's consider something each of us is called upon to address sooner or later. What gives me meaning? What kind of person do I want to be? Where do I belong? Feiler talks about the ABC of what gives me meaning. A stands for agency. And this is a person who gets meaning from activity, from autonomy, freedom, creativity, mastery, pursuing activities that promote this for her or him. And often that is work. These are what we might call the activities of life that one becomes primarily engaged in. The second, the B, is belonging. And this is a person who gets meaning from belonging, meaning focused on relationships, family, friends, community. And the third way, the C, is cause. And that's a person who gets meaning from a calling, a mission, a purpose. Now, Feiler claims that about half the people get their primary meaning from agency, the first of these, that is the activities of life. And perhaps a third or so from belonging, perhaps more female than male when it comes to the belonging focus. And C, the cause, is probably fewer than a quarter of us. Now, one of the things that happens is that it isn't rigid over time, because sometimes we can get overly focused on one of these, and it results in what Feiler calls shape shifting, where, for example, a person who is overly focused on their work might find their family relationships suffering. And so they make a decision to reduce their focus on work activity and give more focus to their family, their loved ones. Or maybe someone will be really involved in family and decide at some point that they need to have a greater purpose. And so they get into that C, that cause. And over time, there can be adjustments to one or the other to put it more into balance. When we consider change that happens in our lives, we have to realize that there is both personal change and communal change. For example, our experiencing an illness, a job change, or the death of a loved one is a personal change. The pandemic or something like 9/11 is a communal change. Also, there is voluntary and non-voluntary change. So, of course, a voluntary change would be our decision to leave a job or to end a relationship. A non-voluntary change would include a car accident or being fired from a job. Most changes tend to be personal, non-voluntary changes. Now, when you're dealing with a major life change that's not of your choosing, is found to be challenging. Feiler points out that you can mitigate its effect on your life by pursuing the following 7 steps. First, don't try to sweep the change under the rug, ignoring it. Rather, make a conscious decision to accept it. This is reality. Identify your emotions around it and give up any illusion of control. Second, market, meaning ritualize the change. You might sing about it, dance about it, hug people, purge it from yourself, write out the history of it. Some people have even written and published a book about the change that has occurred for them. Third, shed it, meaning give up the mindset that you're going to hold on to it. Let it go. Fourth, create it, meaning try new things. If you're losing a loved one to gun violence, some people have pursued a change in laws, started a foundation, gone on a speaking tour, joined or formed support groups. Fifth, share it, meaning seek wisdom from others. Look for counseling, look for support groups that will help you through this. Sixth, launch it, meaning unveil your new self and be ready to move on. And seventh, finally, tell it. Tell it to yourself by composing a fresh story with a victorious prospect and a healthy outlook ahead for you, so that you see yourself rising above. I would like to address the embracing of a spiritual perspective. A couple of changes are happening in this country that I believe are related. Surveys show that church attendance is declining and that this was happening even before the pandemic, and that fewer and fewer people are invested in their spiritual life. We hear more and more about atheism as being accepted by people, especially in this country. And people are more and more invested in worldly pursuits. At the same time, there is greater evidence of anxiety, depression, and suicide for persons individually, and greater division and differences between people collectively, including hardened politics and a division in social grouping throughout our society, where people don't even believe that elections verified by public officials throughout the country have credibility. Excuse me. I believe these two factors are related. A reduced focus on spirituality, which I see as resulting in part in this personal and collective strife. For the last half of my life, up to this point, I have embraced a spiritual path. Now, prior to that time, I was living a life that was focused on my own ego's desire for what I wanted. And I finally got sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so I was led to a Unity church where I embraced the spirituality. I could have turned it down at that point. Fortunately, I made the choice to accept it and to pursue it. And the difference has been so dramatic for my life that I can't explain it. It's so great. I do believe it was no coincidence that I stopped using alcohol and drugs right after entering the Unity Church and committing to a spiritual path. Previous to that time, I was always seeking crutches. Whenever there was a change in my life that was happening, a difficulty, I would look for the crutch, alcohol, drugs, whatever it might be that would divert my pain. Now, change still happens for me, but it doesn't seem to throw me now. I am consistently asking God's guidance and direction, and seeking to follow God's way. So the changes for me now seem more and more like turns in the road rather than shocking events. I am continually marveling at life. So the surprises seem not to overwhelm me. For me, spiritual peace begins with my knowing, my total conviction that life is ongoing. So when we depart this earthly plane, there is something more, something greater, and that this is a wonderful part of enjoying life. This is affirmed by those who've had a near-death experience, where uniformly they report a dimension of peace, beauty, and harmony almost beyond comprehension. I also have my own experience to confirm the strength of the spiritual path, where prior to my engaging in spirituality, I was always having ups and downs, difficulties, not knowing how to handle it, not handling things well. But since I engaged in trusting God and pursuing a spiritual path, my life continues to get better and better. Now, this awareness, this conviction that life is ongoing brings about a peace for me and a total trust in God. I say in my mind, God, what should I be doing with my life? Just as I say, God, what should I be doing with this day? And in each case, the answer comes in what I feel, what I intuit, and how I'm led. So if the guidance directs me, I read or relax or study or call someone or do something else and trust the process. In doing this, the changes that come, and they do, seem to blend in. One thing I do to connect with God is to change my perspective. So sometimes I speak with or focus on God directly. Sometimes I focus in terms of the Holy Spirit or the Christ or Jesus or life itself, capital L, life, or the universe. But in each case, it's always focused on God. It's just my perspective has a different focus to it. And sometimes I change my focus so that I'm allowing God to just take over. And I do what I'm led to do by God. Sometimes it's focus on being of service in some way. Sometimes it's a focus on the beauty around me or with relationships with few people, or on the amazing way our life unfolds, just marveling at how this all comes about. On life miracles, just seeing the babies being such a blessing to the people in their lives. Healings that happen that are so unexpected and so we're so grateful for the support that people offer one another, for the guidance that comes to us, for creativity in so many wonderful ways, for peace in the midst of chaos. It's important to be willing to move from living the purely human experience to living a God experience. Now, this requires balance between being engaged in this earthly experience, which is important to do, and at the same time, living from one's divine self. We can learn it doesn't have to be an either or. It can be a this and experience. An overarching focus is on living a life of service. There is no hierarchy to this. Any person's service is as important as mine. The person who picks up the trash and does so with a spirit of serving others is just as much in service as I am or anyone else. I mentioned earlier that I have identified 9 of what Filer describes as life quakes. 9 of these in my life. Disruptors so impactful that they result in upheaval, time of transition, and a renewal. Interestingly enough, only one of these life quakes has been in the last half of my life up to this point. And this is during this last half of my life when I've been committed to a spiritual path. The other 8 life quakes were during the time when I was focused on satisfying my ego's desires. And this one life quake, since I embraced spirituality, did not impact me negatively. It was my and Lenore's decision to embark upon ministry, where yes, there was an upheaval, a time of transition and a renewal, but it was all positive and fulfilling and uplifting, because this path has opened doors to the blessing of my soul. A key in my experience is to constantly be turning to God in my mind, knowing and trusting that God supports me and what's the very best for me, is waiting to support my requests and to lead me always in the direction of my greater good. Some people would dispute that. I will not try to change their mind, but I do believe in my heart that for every single person, sooner or later, they must come to the point in this lifetime or in a future where they will turn their will and their life over to God. And it is at that point when life becomes blessed and they become a blessing. We hope that this has benefited you in some way and that you may decide to join us afterwards on the Zoom, which was provided you in a link that was sent within the last day or two. God bless you.